Have you wrestled with imposter syndrome, excessive and unsubstantiated self doubt coupled with an uncanny lack of confidence? I'm your host, Betty Danowitz. Listen as I interview highly successful individuals about their experience with this imposter syndrome and how it manifests itself in their lives in this If You Ask Betty podcast series dealing with imposter syndrome. Hi, Jennifer. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Jennifer, tell us about you.
I have been in L&D for about 10 years. I have a master's degree in HR and organizational development from the University of Houston. And as you said, currently I'm managing learning technology for Solemn, which is a global consulting firm.
Very cool. What would you say are your biggest accomplishments in life and in work?
There are two that come to mind for me. One is when my research was published back in 2021. And the second, I would say, was actually recent, just February of this year. I spoke at my first conference. It was ATD Technology in LA.
Very cool. I was there.
Oh, nice.
What was your session?
It was a session on using low-code technology to create custom learning platforms. I actually did like a hands-on session teaching folks to use Power Apps from Microsoft.
Oh, yes. Power Apps. Okay. I've actually designed for Power Apps without ever seeing the app they created.
Oh, interesting. Like you
Which,
did like the design of like the images and stuff like that that were going into the app?
yeah. It was like
Oh,
I did the
okay.
storyboard and then the client put it into their Power App, but I couldn't access it to see it. So in order for them to show it to me, they would have to sort of do a video, like a screen record video,
Got it.
and then
That
send
kind
it
of
to
makes
me.
sense because Power Apps is usually like an internal thing for your
Yeah.
organization. You can't really give access unless you're inside the organization. So yeah, that kind of makes sense.
Yeah. So that's cool. I love that little connection that we have. So if I were to ask other people, what would others say about you?
I think they would say that I'm creative and I'm passionate. Innovation is one of the things that's most important to me. Speaking of the ATD Technology Conference, there was one of the sessions there that talked about just general learning technology and where we are, and how in learning technology we tend to have this cycle of like finding some new shiny thing and focusing on it for a while and trying to like plug it into what we already have and make it work for us, right? I mean, what they were saying was that like the real value of learning technology is in thinking about how we can use technology to do things different, not how we can just use it to
Yeah.
continue to do the same things that we've been doing for a really long time. And that concept is something that's really important to me. And so I think that's one thing that really comes through for people that have worked with me and things like that. Innovation is really important. The impact of what it is that we're building is really important to me. I tend to care a lot, and that often leads me to taking on too much. And I think that's a common experience with people who have experience with feeling like an imposter.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, that's a good lead into my next question, which is what has your experience been with imposter syndrome?
So I remember feeling like an imposter for as long as I can remember. But I first learned about the term, what is commonly now called imposter syndrome, when I got involved in the research. And this was back in 2016 or 2017. I worked with a faculty member at the University of Houston. She had been doing research for a few years on the impact of imposter on faculty members. And we actually designed and pilot tested a workshop that we adapted from the framework of cognitive processing therapy. We worked with some clinicians from the School of Social Work there, and we designed a workshop that we pilot tested to help. So, and it was such a fascinating experience for me to go through, because I remember being in this room of highly successful, intelligent people, right? Because our workshop was aimed at faculty members. So these were largely tenured faculty members at a university. And just sit in there and like, I remember just like, the only thing I could think is, what am I doing here? Right? Like, these are really smart people, and I'm supposed to be teaching them something. I'm supposed to be helping them in some way. But that is what imposter does, right? It tells us that we are not worthy. And so I think it was fascinating for me because I learned so much about it, right? Like, I read all of the previous research. I wrote my own research on it. I know a lot of facts about it, but it doesn't change. And that's one of the things that we saw, is that even the skills that we taught people, the things that they found helpful, they were helpful, but it's not like the experiences ever stopped. It just helps them deal with it differently.
Yeah, agreed. So do you still have, that was a great example, by the way, of having imposter syndrome while teaching people about imposter syndrome, because these people are much higher level professors at the organization. That's like, that's very meta, made my head spin just a little bit, but I followed it. Do you still have sort of episodes of imposter syndrome?
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's continued to come up over the years. When I was writing my thesis, when I was writing the article that got published, even when it was published, like, there was all this like, oh my gosh, I can't possibly be an author, right? Like, this isn't real. A lot of that. And at work, it's something I continue to struggle with too, usually around times of like new projects, starting new things. The past couple of years have been big for me because I've spent a lot of energy at work pushing for new ideas, innovations, building brand new things from scratch. And there feels like there's so much risk in that, right? Like, I think there's the underlying fear that always feels like, at some point I'm not going to be able to do it, right? Like, and somebody's like, just the veil's going to come off. Somebody's going to figure out I've been faking this whole time. I don't know what I'm talking about, right? Clearly not true, but that's the feeling that just kind of stays, you know?
It is. It is. It kind of lays on you like a wet blanket, which I don't know if you've
Yeah.
ever had a wet blanket on you, but it's horrible. You're like, get this thing off of me. It's very uncomfortable.
I'm sure.
So when you're having sort of an episode of this imposter syndrome, how does it manifest itself? So like, for some people it's perfectionism or overachieving or self-sabotage. What do you experience? Like, what happens?
I think for me, a lot of it is there's a ton of procrastination and avoidance, right? When there's new opportunities. Oh my gosh, this might be an opportunity that would expose me as being a fraud or being an imposter, right? So I might avoid things that, like, oh, here's this new thing I really want to try. Even in my personal life, right? Like, I remember finishing grad school and I was like, I have all of this time now. I need new hobbies. I started roller skating for the first time. And even in that, like, I was so embarrassed, right? It's like, so scared to like be bad at something to take that first step, you know. And so I experienced that in a lot of aspects of my life. So procrastination, avoidance, and then there's the other side, which is like the overworking, taking on too much, right? And trying to prove that you're worthy, or at least that's the way it feels for me, right? Like, even in my job, like, constantly, these are habits I've been consciously breaking over the last couple of years, and it's a lot of really tough work. But it's one of the things that I've experienced over the years, is just taking on too much and burning myself out, trying to prove that I deserve the job that I have.
I think that's interesting. Trying to prove that I deserve the job that I already have.
Yeah.
Interesting. I wonder how many people just turned up the volume because they were like, dang, right? Like,
I think
because
that's
I,
one of the hardest things to talk about, to be honest, because that's a scary thing to say, right? Like, oh
mm-hmm,
my gosh, what if somebody I work with hears me say that, right?
well, sure.
That I think I don't deserve my job. And our brain, the imposter, wants to tell us, like, yeah, they're going to be like, oh my gosh. But the truth is, they're probably going to support me. Like, anytime I share that with someone, they're like, no, that's absolutely not true, right?
Yeah.
But it's the feeling.
Plus, do companies really hire people that, you know, aren't qualified?
Aren't qualified. Exactly,
I mean, I
exactly.
think it's rare. Like, I'm not going to say it never happens. I think it's rare. But do they keep people that suck at their job? I mean,
Right.
probably not. Most likely not. Again, very
But
rare.
that's the key to imposter, right? Is it's not just the self-doubt. It's the self-doubt despite evidence, right? Like, here's
That's
all the
right.
things I've done before. Here's all the things that say I am capable of doing this. I have great performance reviews. The people at my work love me, right? Like,
Yes.
there's no reason for me to believe that I don't deserve the job. But there are times when my brain still tells me I don't.
Yeah. Yep. And I just want to pause because I want the people listening to recognize that this isn't just Betty who has spent way too many hours talking to people about imposter syndrome. This is Jennifer who is saying, "Oh, by the way, I taught people who have PhDs about imposter syndrome and I still feel it." Like, I think that's important. Thank you so much for coming on because it's not just, it's not, how do I say this? I said this in another episode. We are not special. Not not you, not me. We're not special. And we should feel comforted by that. Not like we're like, Betty, how could you say I'm not special? Well, you're not. Like, we're all the same in a lot of ways in that we have these weird unfounded feelings of self-doubt, and like we're going to be found out. I love that you use the words, somebody's going to figure out that I don't deserve the job that I already have. Like, that's an amazing, like, most people spend years before they actually recognize that that's what they feel, much less actually be able to say it. So I just hope everybody sort of pauses and like, it is like, dang, like, that's all I can say is, yeah,
Yeah,
truths.
and I hope
Yeah.
so. That is why I share my story and why I love to talk about this, because in our research, we found that one of the most helpful things for folks that participated was normalizing, was understanding, was being in a room and hearing the stories of other people. That was part of the workshop. We paired them up and they got to share those experiences with each other and be vulnerable with each other. And that
Mm-hmm.
normalization, seeing that in someone else, automatically made it a little easier to carry. And so
It does.
that is one of my goals,
It
to
lifts
just
the weight. You're
normalize the
absolutely right.
experience. Yeah.
I love that. And it's funny because I just came upon that word normalize recently. And I think it's because we're starting to normalize the use of normalize, which is very meta, but I do think that's a thing that we're doing. And at first I was like, this is such a dumb word. Like, what are we talking? Like, we all sound like freaking psychiatrists. Yeah, that's correct. We should be using this word because that's what we're trying to do. And like, if anybody listens to my podcast, especially around imposter syndrome, one of the things that I work hard to normalize is the idea of therapy, because I think
Yes.
everyone should have a therapist personally. And I've said this before, but like, because if you make all of your friends your therapist, no one will go to lunch with you,
Well, and
right?
they may not always be the best reflections
Yeah,
either. Like, sometimes,
outside of
and
that,
friends are great,
yeah,
don't get me wrong, but
friends are
sometimes, and yeah, I
great, but
agree. I
like,
have a therapist I see
yeah,
every week. I highly recommend for everyone. When we did the
absolutely.
research too, a lot of the participants even shared that they had therapists
Yes.
that they worked through, because a lot of the skills that we taught are how to deal with the impacts, right? How to lessen the impact on ourselves. But again, everyone reported the experience of feeling like an imposter never went away. They just knew how to deal with it better. But imposter really comes from, it's
That's right.
embedded in those stories that we have about ourselves. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so prevalent, because we live in a society that's grounded in hustle culture and needs you to kind of doubt yourself, to want to be better, to always, be trying harder. And we have to sort of decouple from that experience and really look at the stories that we have about ourselves. And that's the part we do in therapy, right?
It is. And it is sometimes the part that we do at lunch. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, there's nothing wrong with having a friend that you're willing to tell everything to. But eventually, they're going to be like, I can't help you. You're just complaining
Yeah.
now. And that's because that's what you're doing. Like, you're just
Yeah.
spinning. And I'm speaking from experience. You're just spinning in the same thought pattern. And you need somebody who's not connected, isn't emotionally invested, to help pull you out of that. So that is our TED Talk on why everyone should have a therapist. Absolutely. So, okay. So you're saying, okay, so you said it manifests itself in, you said it kind of both sides. Like, one is deep procrastination, which, by the way, I have felt myself today. Like, I think before we started recording, I asked you, do you ever have one of those days when you're like, no, I don't like you. I don't like any of you. Don't talk to me. Yeah, that's just my deep procrastination, because these people all need something from me and I don't want to help anybody with anything because I don't want to do anything.
Yeah.
I'm better now. I just want to clarify that. I'm better now. But like, I had about 6 hours of that today. So I feel that, like, so you talk about deep procrastination. And then of course the other side, which is just hyper work, right? Like, it's gotta be
Mhm.
perfect. Anything else that you feel like you experience on a regular basis, emotionally, physically, mentally? Anything else you'd
I
add?
think you kind of touched on it when you were talking about how you kind of spin in circles, right? You get stuck on a thought, the
Mm,
rumination. Like, that is something that's very common too. You do something, right? You're in a meeting, you say something that, like, maybe you didn't say perfectly, you didn't do correctly, and it just kind of sits and spins, right? And then your brain kind of collects
mm-hmm.
the stories, and that's how it tells you you're not worthy. So sometimes it's about those, like, little tiny individual experiences as well that just kind of build up.
It's so true. It's so true. And I have a daughter who's 21, and earlier she was like, "So, mom, why are you spinning?" And I was like, "Don't talk logic to me. Don't. I can't." She's like, "Do you want to go out to eat? Would that get you out of your funk?" And I'm like, "No, but we should go out to eat." Like,
Can I just
like, I'm just
say,
being
I
honest.
love how much emotional
Yeah,
intelligence the next generation has. Like, I'm so excited about
it's
it.
amazing.
It's
Yeah,
great.
it's as long as they use their power for good and not evil,
Yes.
I'm excited about it.
Yeah.
Yes. Um, but yeah, so the spinning, like, that's a real thing. And I still imagine somebody else just turned it up just a little bit louder because they're like, oh, I spin all the time. What are they talking about? Um, so okay, so when you think about the way that it manifests itself, so the spinning, the procrastination, the hyper work, is there are there other contributing factors, right? So, like, we've talked in previous episodes about things that trigger people, and you actually mentioned some earlier, like when you're being newly evaluated at a job, you've got new responsibilities and expectations. Maybe you just feel different when you're isolated. Those are all things that kind of contribute. But is there something else about you that kind of makes this imposter phenomenon happen?
I think it's interesting that you asked that question, because I think imposter is always sort of an individual experience, because, like we said, it's wrapped up in those stories that we have about ourselves. And so, in my case, for example, I'm neurodivergent. I process information differently than most people. I don't interact in social situations the way that most people would all of the time. And so I think it's anything that creates sort of that otherness, contributes to a feeling of being an imposter, not being worthy, right? So I think there can be so many different things individually that can contribute. For me, I definitely think that's one of them.
Mhm. Anything else?
Um, Nothing specifically. Like, there are a lot of, well, there are a lot of kind of common experiences that I think, I've seen throughout the research and things like that. But that's the only thing really specific that comes to mind for me.
Yeah. I've had, in this particular run of interviews, I've had quite a few people bring up, or I've brought up, the birth order. So I'm just curious,
Oh.
are you a firstborn? Are you an only? If I had to guess, I'm just going to guess, and I'm probably going to be wrong because I don't know. But I think you're probably an only or a
I'm a
baby.
youngest. I'm a baby.
Yeah, you're a baby. See, I went
I'm the
both,
youngest.
or a baby. Like, and it's funny because sometimes you can tell someone's an only or a firstborn, because that's definitely a connection. Or they could be an only or a baby. There's typically not an only or a middle. Like, they're just not the same. But yeah, okay, so you're the youngest. Do you think that has anything
Yeah.
to do with it? And if the answer is no, that's okay. I just wonder, what is your opinion about that?
No, the answer is totally yes. And there's even research on this that I've read, that how we grow up in those early years really impacts this. And I think the
Mm-hmm.
research that I read, the paper I read, had kind of three different examples of children. And it didn't really talk specifically about maybe birthing order, but the expectations placed on the child. So, for example,
Yes. Yeah.
someone who's a youngest child, right, like might have a certain expectation put on them of how they're supposed to behave, who they're supposed to be, or even if you're, it doesn't matter, you're an only child or not, if you have parents that have very high expectations around school and grades and things like that, like you're expected to be perfect, those things are
Yeah.
going to be drilled into you. And so I think all of that experience as a child really does impact.
I agree. I agree. And it's interesting because in the series of interviews, they're all different birth orders. So I've had middle, I've had firstborn, I've had babies, I've had only children, and they all say that those expectations impact their level of imposter syndrome. So if they all say yes, that means none of them really impacts it. Or does it mean that they all do, but just in their own way? Right?
Yeah,
Because I'm like, well, there's not one particular one that's sticking out. Exactly. I go back to the whole "you're not special"
exactly.
thing, right?
Yeah. Well, you have to dig a
Yeah,
level deeper, I think. It's the,
a little
okay,
bit deeper.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
the youngest child. Why do I feel those? Like for me, I was the youngest and I had two older siblings who got in a lot of trouble, right? And so I was the one that was expected to be the good kid. Like I was like, nope, I watched them get in trouble, right? So then I felt this expectation
Yes.
on me. So I think there's like a deeper level to it. And that's why it's not consistent, is they may feel that way
Yeah.
because they're in that birthing order, but there's something below it, right?
There's something else. Yeah, there's something else that's more common. I love that you said that your your older brothers and sisters, I'm just assuming you have one of each, but your older
I do.
siblings, maybe that's better, um, are got in trouble. So basically your parents handed you a halo and said, "Don't break it. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
we're going to need you to be the angel because we're tired."
Yeah, yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you probably took that and put it on and still wear
Exactly. I took it with me throughout my whole
it.
life. Wore it as a
That's right.
badge of
That's right.
honor.
That's right. That's right. I think that that's something they entrusted to you. So yes, absolutely. Wear that.
I've since
I
taken it off.
appreciate you sharing that. Oh, that's exciting.
That's a whole other like
It's like
body of
the
work.
yeah, that's like the Sugar Ray song, right? So that there's a halo hanging on the corner of her. What is it? Four
Oh.
post bed. We'll just leave that. Um, yeah, I'm so grateful that you shared your experiences with that. I got one more question for you. Why did you want to be part of this imposter syndrome project?
Excuse me. I think it goes back to the normalization. Opening up the conversation. I've started this conversation in my own work, ran some workshops within my organization to help people, overcome some of this stuff too. And I find the more that people open up the conversation, the lighter they feel, right? Because it's the
Mm-hmm.
normalization, but it's also the community. right? When you realize you're not the only one, when you have someone else that you can call and say, like, hey, I am spiraling about this, and they can relate, they know what you're going through. It's
Yeah.
so different from sitting in the shame of it, because that's the most harmful part, I think, is when we don't tell the story. It builds the shame of I'm not good enough, I am not worthy. And the only way, I think, was it Brene Brown that said this? I'm sure it is, because she's like the queen of shame, right? But
Yes.
like, it's the only way to get rid of shame is to talk about it, is to bring it into the light. And so that's my hope with the conversation.
I love that. Yes, Brene Brown does say that in The Gifts of Imperfection, which is a book that changed my life. And yes, basically, you have to bring shame out of the shadows, and then it's no longer shame; it's just your history.
Exactly. And when we
So
see how
that's
common our histories are, right? When we see how common that experience is.
yeah, exactly. Then we realize we're not special. Maybe I should write a book called
You're
"You're
not
Not
special.
Special: Normalizing Imposter Syndrome." I don't know. There's something in there. There's something there. But well, thank you so much, Jennifer Flores, for sharing your experience with us. And thanks to the listeners. I hope you will continue with this series and hear more stories about dealing with imposter syndrome. There's so many amazing people that deal with this every day, and sharing their story helps them and you feel less alone. So be sure to follow If You Ask Betty on LinkedIn and YouTube for more episodes and resources, and tell your friends about it. Hit that share button so that they also know that they are not alone. Peace out.